So good morning. I'm proud to introduce the next speaker, our keynote, Professor James Ackerman, Jim for the friends. Here I have a short note about his bio. James is a professor at the University of Costa Rica, Rio Piedras, and director of the University Herbarium and Zoology Museum. He received his PhD from Florida State University under the direction of Norris Williams, and was also mentored by Bob Dressler, a legend of the orchids history at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. These are the facts, but Jim is a living legend in the orchid world, in the orchid science. He has conceived, researched, written and published a lot of seminal papers on a broad range of topics, including palynology, population genetics, pollination biology, and also systematic and floristics. And if you want to suggest another topic, it's very probable that he wrote something very important about it. So last but not least, Jim is one of the few recipients of the Lancaster Medal on Orchid Science, a close collaborator of the garden, and a dear friend of mine. So let us receive him with a loud applause.
Either way, maybe I'll do this. Sounds better. All right, thank you for the kind lies, but most of them are true. And I very much appreciate the Lancaster Botanical Garden and University of Costa Rica and all my buddies and that have got me over here. Once again, convinced me to come. Didn't take much to do that, though. So, so thank you to you guys and gals. So today I'm going to talk about how to make a species-rich family. And although I have published papers on bromeliads and aeroids, and one on aeroids, and I don't think any grasses, maybe some, no, probably not palms. But anyway, if you know my work, it's orchids. So that's what I'm going to talk about, is orchids. The easy answer to how to make a species-rich family is, it's because Mother Nature has an inordinate fondness for orchids. And I could end this talk right then and there, but I won't. So we're gonna dive into this. And we're gonna start with the early days of orchid evolution. This is an ancient paper by Santiago Ramirez, but basically, and a number of papers, of course, have followed this. But the basic message is that orchids are a very old family, and so it goes back. The origin of orchids goes back to the late Cretaceous and maybe even earlier than what Santiago had found, but it doesn't matter. It's just basically it's an old family, and he was able to do this because of this bee that with a pollinarium. We can more or less identify that, and then of course since then there have been other pretty good orchid fossils. So how How rich is rich? Well, you know, we got probably around 30,000 plus species, and if you were listening to, paying attention to some of the talks, you know, it's like that clock, the doomsday clock. It keeps on ticking and ticking and getting higher and higher and getting close to, I don't know, orchid Armageddon. So the old age of the family would presumably allow for a nice, slow, laid-back, gradual rate of diversification. But the only problem is that much of the current diversity is relatively recent. Okay, so what are the factors that are associated with orchid diversity? Well, pretty much every single character of the orchid family has been blamed for generating diversity. So, you know, you might realize that that's not very helpful. So I reduced it down to a list of the most likely factors that may be involved in diversification of orchids. So, you know, the obvious, and some of them are pretty obvious. Well, it's because it's the tropics, and there's lots of reasons why tropics are so diverse and beyond orchids. And so throw the orchids in there. It's because of the tropics. It could be pollinator relationships, mycorrhizal associations, wind dispersed dust-like seeds and pollinia. Oh my goodness. Succulence and crassulacean, acid metabolism, genome size. Oh, did we hear about genome size the other day? And epiphytism. You know, of course, when I say that, I think Gerhard Zotz wakes up. And then, of course, mountainous habitats. So, you know, they all been blamed. So I'm not going to leave that list alone because we're going to go into I don't really want to say a deep dive, you know, because I really don't know a whole lot about this stuff. But anyway. So most orchids reside in the tropics. So it must be the tropics, right? That's the basic rationale. But you know, there is higher tree diversity, and most orchid diversity is in the trees. So there's more potential phorophytes, higher functional diversity of pollinators, and it could be higher diversity of orchid mycorrhizal fungi. But in this paper that I kind of cite there, I went skimming through that, and I got the feeling that we don't really know. So all you mycorrhizal people out there, you know, dig into that for me, and I appreciate it. Of course, the stock answer for why there are so many orchid species, it's because of pollination. And well, yeah, duh. I mean, it's quite remarkable things that orchids do to pollinators. So it must be adaptive radiation for pollinators that driving the diversity of orchids. And probably the most classic case of this is from Steve Johnson's work with his buddies in South Africa on Disa. And I'm not sure whether this phylogeny has withstood the test of time, but I kind of think it has, more or less. But that's not really the point of it. He has mapped out all the different kinds of pollinators that are involved in Disa. And that includes a whole bunch of very different kinds of flies, different functional aspects to them, tangle-wing flies, syrphid flies, muscoid flies, settling moths, hawk moths, butterflies, wasps, bees, you know. And then you can throw in the ones that are autogamous, just for the heck of it, you know, because there are some. But the DISA case is really unusual, and Steve, in this paper, admits that. He says, hey, this is a kind of an unusual case for orchids. And in fact, in the paper that me and my colleagues published last year, we could see the same amount of functional diversity that occurs in DISA only at like the subfamily level. So it's, yeah, DISA is weird. So, yeah, not so sure that's really helpful. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into the thought of pollination driving orchid diversity. And one thing that Barbara Gravendale had done 20 years ago, she was enthralled about the idea that being an epiphyte is important for orchids. And she's actually right. And one of the things that she did was that said, well, if pollinators are important, then variants that improve the pollinator effectiveness and efficiency should lead to higher specificity. And so the question is, does specificity for pollinators lead to species-rich genera? And her answer, as you could see up here on the slide, is no. But along comes Florian Schistel and his buddy, Schluter. And they had completely different kind of approach to this question, and in a much smaller sample size. And what they found was, well, yes. So is it yes, or is it no? So along comes Tremblay, and my co-author of this event. He likes to play with dots and lines. And he produced this, and we were using the data from our pollination list that we published last year, and we update every year, freely available online. And so you can see here, mean number of pollinators. One. Oh, this is a log scale. I have a hard time interpreting this, but basically not very many pollinators, a lot of pollinators. And the number of species per genus, another log scale. And basically this means not very many species per genus here and a lot up there. And then there's a horizontal line there. That should tell you that there's no relationship. So that's pretty clear. Another way of looking at it is the median number of pollinator species per orchid species is 1. The mean number is higher, is 3, and that's because, as you could see here, there's some genera here that are just like off the charts, ridiculous in the number of pollinators involved. So, yeah. So that's a no, by the way. So we agree with Barbara. All right. But Salvatore Cozzolino and Widmer, they said, hey, it's got to be deceit pollination, because way back in those days, it was 1/3 of the orchid species are deceiving their pollinators. And that was repeated over and over again ad infinitum over the decades. And it was, actually it came from Vanderpill and Dodson paper, not paper, their book, Orchid Flowers, Pollination and Evolution. All right. But we know now that, well, actually it's 47% if you ignore the autogamous species. It's 47% of allogamous orchids are pollinated by deceit. Okay. So he's suggesting them. But along comes Tom. Where's Tom? Oh, there he is. Tom. Surprisingly, Tom comes along virtually and found that opposite. Deceit pollination is more associated with extinctions than speciation, resulting in a negative net rate of diversification. This really is surprising. Well, so is deceit a bad thing? Is it detrimental? Well, if you think about it, if deception or deceit pollination systems is the ancestral condition, then there should be an evolutionary trend towards offering rewards. And for Johnson, back to DISA, he said, yeah, that's the case. The ancestral DISA is presumed to be deceiving their pollinators, and that rewards were evolved later. And the answer is yes for European Orchidae, in another paper, more recent. But here we have a contradiction, a no for neotropical epidendrum. So the overall generalization here would be yes, no, maybe so. All right, what about orchid bee pollination? Okay, this is more close to my heart because that's what I did my dissertation on way back when. And Tom's work and his buddies say yes, yeah. And there's, by my count, over 1,000 orchid species that are served by euglossine bees, male euglossine bees that collect floral fragrances, which are used in sex displays to attract females. But the problem here is that, this is strictly neotropical, and not all orchids, in case you didn't realize, are not all orchids are neotropical. They occur other places. The other thing about this that occurred to me is that a change in floral fragrance composition can attract a different set of pollinators in these male euglossine bee pollination systems. So you can get like instant reproductive isolation, and then later populations can diverge through selection or drift. So it would seem to be very easy in a sense. So if that's the case, well, why not all sex-based means of attraction, in other words, pseudo-copulation, why wouldn't that be the same thing? We expect those species that are offering producing a pheromone-like fragrance attract males, and sex is a powerful thing, in case you didn't know. So they attract males and seeking mates, and this includes very species-rich genera. Lepanthes, of course, is off the charts. Telepogon, a lot of species. Ophrys and Caladinia. And if I remember later on in the talk, I'll return to this idea. And the phylograms that have been published on these indicate clades that have very little sequence divergence, suggesting that they may evolve rapidly. All right. So I hope I left you a little uneasy about pollination as the driver, because it's kind of muddy. What about, speaking of mud, let's go into the dirt and look at mycorrhizal associations. Tupac Otero and Nicola Flanagan suggested, hey, stop looking up above and look down below. After all orchids are mycoheterotrophs, at least at germination stage. And there's generally a high specificity for orchid mycorrhizal fungi that are involved in seed germination. But there's a study by Suarez and Wright actually has another study that shows that closely related, narrowly endemic species use the same fungus. So it's not specificity for a fungus that would isolate populations. They're using the same thing. So, but what about the orchid mycorrhizal fungi? Could it have other influence on diversification of orchids? Well, a lot of these orchid mycorrhizal fungi have extensive ranges, but they're not uniformly distributed, of course, at all scales. And for those people that have looked at it, hyphal densities fluctuate a lot depending on, the resources that are available to them. It's kind of like, duh. So there can be tremendous temporal and spatial heterogeneity in sites where orchids can become established. And that may result in small, hyper-dispersed orchid populations that we often mention. And this would enhance reproductive isolation, and that would facilitate evolution of local adaptations and diversification. Okay, the next factor, pollinia and wind-dispersed seeds, and this is important. With pollinia, a single pollination event can deliver a massive amount of pollen, and but on the other hand, the frequency of visitation is often very low. So fruit production is low, but it's kind of compensated in a sense in the fact that the seed crops are massive. And of course, we always like to point out that there are certain genera that can produce 3 to 4 million seeds in one fruit. On the other hand, I've counted seeds in a Neotia fruit, less than 100. So we don't actually talk about the range very much. But the point is that they can produce lots of these dust-like seeds. And so that's going to relate to epiphytism. I'll link all these later. Here's Bob Dressler, and give me the side eye. And in his 1981 book on natural history and classification of Orchidaceae, of orchids, he mentions that water conservation traits of epiphytes evolved in terrestrials of seasonally dry tropical climates. What's the basis for this statement? Well, probably not a whole lot, but it sounds good. Most orchids resided in trees, and by Tom's account, they're strongly associated with orchid diversification. I think by all our accounts. But traits that are associated with epiphytism are these. And they've been listed independently before earlier in my my talk. But it's all related to epiphytism. Succulence, crassulacean, acid metabolism, and so forth. And the other thing is about being an epiphyte is presumably, and it's mentioned a bunch of times in the literature, that it's a stressful environment. And that in some ways either generates variation or accelerates selection of variants. Maybe you guys can tell me what it is. When I mentioned stress to Gerhard Zotz, he just rolled his eyes. Don't tell me about stress. Okay, succulence. Succulence is presumed to have evolved in response to water. Preceded Eocene evolution of the epiphytic habit. And this is a recent paper by collaborators. I thought, oh, okay, so far it sounds like Bob is right. And then crassulacean acid metabolism is, from the posters out here, that is, a very flexible metabolic thing, and at least in some orchids. And it's evolved multiple times in different clades of orchids. And back to Tom, it is one of the strongest traits associated with net diversification rates. Okay, genome size. We got small genomes, we got big genomes, we got medium-sized genomes. We learned yesterday that there's a complete range of genome size, but at least in earlier accountings of genome size, it appears to be bimodal. They're smaller in epiphytes than in terrestrials. And genome size is associated, as mentioned yesterday, faster cell cycles for rapid response to sporadic water and nutrient availability. Okay, that makes sense. And then it's also associated with reduced guard cell size, higher stomatal densities. And those things are related to keeping the evapotranspiration under control. Underwater, beep. Okay, so where is the homeland of the rich? We're talking about orchids, of course. Orchid diversity hotspots, and this is from Oscar's paper that came out yesterday, or whenever it was, earlier this year. Oscar and all his, he's got a lot of friends, judging from the number of authors on that paper. I guess I'm included in that. But anyway, here's, he didn't do the circles. I did the circles. But this is, where, for example, a lot of, some of the biggest hotspots are, southern or southeastern and southwestern Australia, over by New Guinea, some stuff scattered in Asia, just a little bit here and there. Madagascar and South Africa, Atlantic forest area, Brazil, and then of course the northern Andes all the way up through Mesoamerica. So those are mostly tropical and subtropical regions. So those are the hot spots. But it's not necessarily where all the action is. So dropping out in diversification rates are, according to Oscar's and Oscar's paper, you can forget about Australia. Look at that. It's blue. It means it's cold. in those cold in terms of diversification, maybe cold in terms of temperature too. At least for me, as being used to the tropics. South Africa is the same way, but there's some that remain pretty hot, and as it turns out, practically all of South America is a hot spot. So that's it's truly amazing. And the hottest of the hot is, believe it or not, right here. Right here. And the coldest are, well, it's cold, aside from in this room. There's temperate and Arctic regions, of course. It's pretty cold. It's kind of amazing to me that some of those, maybe this is where I'm gonna return to the pollination thing, about sex deception and how that might be, a driver of orchid diversity. Well, most of those orchids in Australia are involved in sex deception, but they're not evolving real fast. And then ophrys, up in the Mediterranean region, you would think that that's be a really hot spot too, but no, they're actually not diversifying very, very fast there. Okay, so I remembered to go back to that. Okay, so what do we know so far? We know the patterns. High diversity and diversification rates are associated with epiphytism and all those associated traits that combined with these mountainous regions of rapid geological change. So those two things are important. And so we're going to consider this idea, persistent habitat instability at all scales, from the local scale like this, little pathetic Campylocentrum fasciola, to on a twig. That twig is not going to last very long. So that's very ephemeral. And then we can scale up to millions of years. And so this is a diagram from Benzing back in, not quite in the Cretaceous, but close. So environmental conditions in a tree are quite ephemeral, aside from natural branch shedding, bark shedding, that kind of thing. The environmental conditions as a tree grows and senesces, light intensity and light quality changes, moisture regimes can change, nutrient availability changes, so as well as air movement and the biotic environment, like the mosses and the lichens and the beasts that occur in trees. And of course, the substrate stability is not stable. So epiphytes must have the physiological or developmental plasticity to cope with this change, or they go fishing, or I guess I said hunting. They hunt for suitable habitat. And how do they hunt for that suitable habitat? Well, remember all those dust-like, wind-dispersed seeds? That's how they do it. So it's the mobility through seed dispersal. And it results in metapopulation dynamics. When your substrate is falling apart, amongst your roots, well, you better, pick up and pack your bags and go someplace else. So there's so some populations are coming and going. And this concept is important for where I'm trying to lead you. So populations are often small, hyperdispersed, especially for epiphytes. And actually, orchids are surprisingly resilient, and that might be expected of plants that grow in naturally unstable, stressful. Sorry, Gerhardt. All right. Okay, let's scale up. Habitat instability is prolonged in time and space. Of course, you know, we have volcanoes right in our backyard here, and of course, in other areas of high orchid diversity, lots of volcanism. And it's volcanism and just orogenesis. And so the richest regions of the world are in these areas that are relatively recent with ongoing topographic changes. It is also accompanied by severe earthquakes and violent volcanisms. Yeah, it's not just, you know, like in Hawaii where the lava just gently flows out of a volcano. No, it's not like that. They can blow up. So it's also in areas that have severe earthquakes, as you might imagine, and in fact, I'm showing a picture of landslides. Back in 1978 or 79, there was a 7.7 earthquake, 7.7 on the Richter scale, earthquake on the Chocó region of Pacific coast of Colombia. And this wall hanging here that I took a picture of from the Museum of Modern Art. Actually, I didn't. This came from Science Magazine. And this is Nancy Garwood's paper. After that earthquake, they flew over that region and they took aerial photos. Fortunately, this is uninhabited, you know, old forest. All that black area are landslides. And the scale of this is about 3 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Now, if that isn't habitat instability, I don't know what is. Okay, and then we scale up to global climate change. You know, there are climate cycles, and this goes on for decades to millions of years and generates stress. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that word. A minor glaciation occurred, for example, about 3,000 years ago in the northern Andes, and the vegetation had to migrate about 1,000 meters to lower elevations. And then a recent paper talked about global cooling is associated with diversification of terrestrial Orchidoideae. So, you know, global warming in the tropics may reduce area of suitable habitat for both terrestrials and epiphytes, and enhance fragmentation. And so the time frame, you know, that, you know, one figure published in Oscar's paper, I forget the original source. I know Steve Kirby mentions this, that you know, the increase in elevation in these mountain ranges around here can proceed about 1,000 meters per million years, and that's pretty fast. And then about literally 2 weeks ago, this paper came out in Science by Liu with the Madagascar escarpment erosion, and showed this graph here. And this paper is about plant diversity. Where all the plant diversity is along that escarpment that runs north-south on Madagascar on the eastern side. And their point in that paper was that this is very unstable area by erosion. And I look at this chart and I'm going, well, this looks familiar. And I sort of figured out, you know, how fast that was moving. It's 1,000 meters per million years, except it's not vertical, it's horizontal. So the bottom line here is that, you know, the Earth is changing, and where it's changing fast, it seems to be where orchids are. Okay. So given that instability is persistent at multiple spatial and temporal scales, and metapopulation dynamics are essential for long-term persistence, and suitable habitats, often isolated, fragmented either by landslides or just by simply, you know, the series of ridges and valleys, you know, in these very youthful mountains or fast eroding landscapes. And you would think these small dust-like seeds would be able to circumvent these dynamics and these barriers, but apparently that's not really the case, as Pato Sanchez and collaborators point out. They do not easily disperse across these habitat barriers. So when fruit set is often low and low effective population sizes and biparental seed crops of many thousands of seeds, the many possible genotypes in just a biparental mating can be quite remarkable, and unusual combinations, perhaps even hopeful monsters from the orchid code may be involved. So dispersed seed and those that become established have a higher probability of not being representative of parental populations. And this brings us to the drift selection model, which is akin to, 1 minute, it's akin to Wright's shifting balance theory. And this was brought up by Gentry and Dodson in their paper on epiphytes back in '87. And then Jess Zimmerman and Mitch A. brought it up in '89, and they're unaware what Gentry and Dodson had said. And then Tremblay, that guy again, here he is, when he was young and beautiful. And they're suggesting that speciation may accelerate through genetic drift, and heated up by repeated bouts of founding events and constantly having to establish new populations. So intense selection would be required to overcome drift in small populations, and so change is likely to be spasmodic. So is this drift selection model ubiquitous? Well, in that Tremblay paper, it was cited about 750 times up through last year. And there were 25, the whole paper is all about, the drift selection model, building up to that. But only 25 of those 750 papers actually addressed the drift selection model. 15 found evidence consistent with drift selection model, and thank you very much. And then 10 found no evidence for the model. We're not going to mention those because, So the answer to this question is sadly no. And so this is what ecologists do when their generalizations don't work. We're going, well, it's context dependent. So it's got to be context dependent. And under conditions of small populations, fragmented landscapes, persistent instability, both climate, geology, but mostly epiphytic habitats. And so let me wrap this up, because he already gave me the 1 minute thing, and I'm going to go over by a minute and 14 seconds. Despite a high degree of specialization, Orchids as a group are remarkably resilient both ecologically and evolutionarily. Their habitats, especially those of epiphytes, are characterized by persistent instability at extreme spatial and temporal scales, like from here to woo. And these ephemeral habitats are captured by dispersal capabilities of orchids, and this is to an extent, random process. So habitat proliferation and fragmentation in geologically active tropical regions of the world create opportunities for isolation and local adaptation. All right, here it comes. Habitat instability drives metapopulation dynamics, forces repeated founder events, and orogenesis and erosion creates fragmented habitats, limiting the homogenizing effects of repeated gene flow among populations, powering the engine of diversification. And that, my friends, is the drift, selection, and instability model of orchid diversification.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. And I know this conference is about monocots, but for example, the Asteraceae are super different from orchids in basically every aspect. Yet they have comparable number of species. So in terms of the whole angiosperms, what do you think that are the causes of species-rich families? Do you think the same factors affect those? Thank you.
I knew that question was going to come. So I decided not to prepare for it. And I think, well, first of all, for every family, it's context dependent. The Asteraceae is like, wait a minute, they seem to be so different, doing things so different. Well, are there any astrologists? And I don't mean, astronauts. Well, maybe they're astronauts for the Asteraceae. No, nobody's here. Not surprising, given the topic of I don't know. Yeah. And I think they need to figure out their answers. And I don't even know whether they're even attempting that, to address those questions. Maybe some of you can tell me. So sorry for the non-answer. No, I'm not sorry at all, but
So I see a lot of other hands, the quickest gain.
Oh, there's Steve back there.
I think your point connects your earlier observation that Costa Rica and Western Panama are hotspots for orchid diversity, and they have some of the youngest, highest coast ranges in the world. And many of them have gotten to several thousand meters in elevation over a very short period of time, a few million years. And I think this is the major connection. Where you get the elevation change rates, that you get the high diversity rates. And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe time for another quick question that doesn't mean a quick answer. Okay.
All right, we're done.